Hi everyone, this is Andy Blow, founder of Precision Hydration, and this is a special edition of the Physical Performance Show, all about the complicated and argumentative topic of hydration for athletes.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. As athletes, we all recognise that hydration is key for health and performance. But over the years, there have been many mixed messages, from drinking to thirst, to avoiding dehydration at all costs, through to making sure we are not too overhydrated and risking the ill effects of hyponatremia. So how do we make sense of hydration science? That is our focus for this expert edition with Andy Blow, sports scientist and founder of Precision Hydration. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. And of course, we do this across a range of different episodes, featured performers, expert editions, interest editions, and coaches' corners. And on this expert edition, Andy Blow explores the history around hydration for performance, drinking to thirst versus drinking to a schedule, what to do before we exercise, special considerations for hot environmental conditions, hydration needs relating to the length of an event, sub 60 minutes right up to 9 to 10 hours plus, and the importance of understanding our own sweat rate and sweat concentration in trying to best look after our own hydration needs and therefore performance. Get ready with a pen and paper. There are a bunch of learnings coming your way. But first, by way of bio, as mentioned, Andy Blow is the founder of Precision Hydration, a sports scientist who has co-authored a number of scientific studies and books, and he has worked at the elite level of performance throughout his career, including enjoying the role as team sports scientist for the Benetton and Renault Formula One racing teams, and ongoing work with the Porsche Human Performance Centre. In addition, Andy himself is an accomplished triathlete, having won an XTERRA World Title and boasting numerous top 10 Ironman and 70.3 finishes to his former triathlon racing resume. Here is my conversation on all things hydration science with Andy Blow. Andy Blow, this is going to be, I think, quite a wrestling to the ground of what seems to be such complex science, hopefully into some real key takeaways, some real key learnings for the listeners of the show. So welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thanks for the invite, Brad. I'm really delighted to be able to come on and chat with you about this.
Andy, hydration science, it sounds so simple, but I've needed to request extra time to prepare for this this call in order to make sure we do cover the bases that will help listeners of the show, walk away with digestible takeaways. But before we get into the learnings, let's paint a picture around your career, both professionally with sports science, founding of Precision Hydration, and also your quite accomplished background in the sport of triathlon.
Yeah, well, it was sort of the intermingling of all that. Studying sports science is what I did as a student at the University of Bath back in the late 1990s, and I drifted into that because of my love for sport in general. And at that time, I was super focused on triathlon. And then it was through doing triathlon to a sort of reasonable level and getting to visit some hot countries and race in some hot places that I actually learned the hard way that hydration and sweating and hydration was a huge issue for me as an individual. And so it was those three things kind of coming together that eventually led to Precision Hydration, because I had a little bit of academic understanding of the physiology of what was going on. But what I found when I put that learning into practice as a triathlete was actually I came up a bit short. You know, the advice that I'd read about, the stuff that were the interpret, or at least my interpretation of it all, wasn't working in practice, because I was racing in hot and humid climates some of the time and having an absolute shocker. And basically it all led back to, you know, fluid balance, hydration, salt loss, all these sort of things that now we talk about to athletes all the time with precision hydration.
And Andy, I believe it was a doctor colleague of yours that sort of switched some of the early lights on as to what some of your performance decrements may be.
Yeah, definitely. It was a great guy called Dr. Raj Jutli, who's an accomplished heart surgeon. And Raj and I worked together on a few projects sort of side by side. He wrote a book called the Motorsport Fitness Manual, because he's a very enthusiastic practitioner of medicine for motor racing drivers and athletes. And I worked in motorsport for a while with Formula One teams. And we sort of co-wrote this book. And then it was getting to know him through that process. I was talking to him about the problems I'd had and was having as an athlete, you know, with salt and sweat loss. And he put me on the right track to understanding that in far more detail. So, yeah, he gave me a massive nudge in the right direction, and also provided a lot of, you know, that kind of reassurance that what we were doing was founded in good science, because this is a guy that, you know, really understands the physiology of electrolyte balance in the blood and those sort of things. And yeah, he got me tested in a hospital. We looked at, you know, sweat tests and that kind of thing back before many athletes were talking about them, and then ran me through the numbers and showed me what I was doing compared with what he maybe thought I should be doing. And obviously, with all these things, the tipping point was when I tried out what he was suggesting. For me, it was like night and day. You know, it was like flicking a switch. I was able to go into the heat. I was able to perform way better. A lot of the problems that I was having went away. And at that point, you know, I was sold on the idea and thought, this is something that more athletes should understand a bit better.
And this was all alongside, and you know, your athletic success, a world, an XTERRA World Title, multiple top 10 Ironman finishes, and 70.3 triathlon top 10s as well. So you had this success athletically, but you were also at this point entrenched in the motorsport world. Is that correct?
Yeah, kind of in parallel a little. So I when I did my degree in sport and exercise science, I was really fortunate to get a placement working with the Benetton Formula One team. And funnily enough, ended up working for a little while with an Aussie driver, Mark Webber, who came through their program. So he was a great bloke to work with. And yeah, so I did that, and I was running training camps for the drivers and doing their physiological testing. And my boss at the time, a guy called Bernie Shrewsbury, was big into triathlon. He'd, I think, been to the Commonwealth Games for triathlon back in the early days when it was an exhibition event for Great Britain or for England. And he sort of pushed me, because I'd had a sort of semi-promising little push at triathlon when I was at university. He pushed me to carry on and sort of gave me the room in my job role to expand and race. And actually, I went on and raced full-time a little bit, not really alongside working, but kind of I worked for a bit, then raced full-time for a bit, and had this great opportunity to really give it my all with going at sport. And I find, and I've said this to a few people before, I think I found that by having that opportunity to go all in with sport, train as hard as you can, as much as you can, I learned so much from that process at that age. Because when you go all in, you kind of don't leave any stone unturned. And that was the sweat thing was part of that for me. The other thing I kind of, without digressing too much, I think I learned quite a lot about was overtraining, because I was, you know, because endurance sports is classic for that, right? You know, and I did my fair share of that as well.
I mean, the overtraining, I think it's, I think everyone has to, you know, swallow that pill at some point. But your own challenges, are there any particular stories or horror stories that, you know, you'd share around what went wrong for you?
I think one of the most disappointing ones for me was qualifying for the Hawaii Ironman, which was kind of the holy grail of the second part of my triathlon career, was to go to Hawaii and do well. And I qualified and felt like I was set to do really well. and then went and fell apart in the race. Had a horrible experience, and a big part of that, some of it was due to niggling injuries, being picked up on the way in and a bit of overtraining, but a lot of it was also to do with this hydration factor, because obviously training in the UK to go and compete in Kona is a challenge. We just don't have, unless you've got access to a climate chamber or something, you don't really have the chance to prepare properly. And I was left guessing. And when I look back at what I ate and what I drank during that race, and it was just very disheartening. And despite the fact I qualified for Kona on a few occasions after that initial attempt, because it had been so expensive and so disheartening, I always kind of pushed them off until I got to the point where I realised I probably wasn't going to go back, or certainly not in that phase of my life go back. And that was pretty disheartening. And then the other time when I really screwed up with hydration was I drank way too much water for the World Championships, the World Long Course Championships in Nice, when I was racing for Great Britain as an elite. And again, had just like the most terrible experience. And I'd qualified quite strongly and was like proud to be part of the team, and then walked most of the run and was a horrible, just mess afterwards. And those sort of things, I look back on them and they are, still not, they're definitely not raw anymore, but they're not fantastic memories. I've got better memories as an athlete.
Still feel the pain, and definitely not the run split you wanted. Yeah. And we'll talk about that, obviously that overhydration, hyponatremic state. So Andy, let's jump in on this. I was researching and getting ready for this, and I couldn't help but go back and reference a chapter in Christy Ashwinton's book, Good to Go, where she talks about, the chapter's titled Be Like Mike, Michael Jordan. Yeah. And she gives the history of sports drinks and some of the, concomitant messaging, advertising around those in the early 90s. I remember clearly as a junior triathlete seeing my heroes drinking sports drinks and thinking, right, well, that's what I have to do. And there was definitely that adage of, if a little's good, more must be better. How have things changed, Andy, over the decades, from everyone knows the Gatorades and the Powerades and the Lucozades? Where does the landscape sit at the moment in terms of, I guess we're starting with sports drinks? Yeah,
well, I think you're dead right. The messaging over the years has changed quite a bit. And if you go pre-sports drinks, the messaging was all about abstinence. It was all about not drinking, basically. Most people were told to limit what they drank or not, or the idea of drinking during sport was almost like it was a sign of weakness. You should try not to drink. There's loads of examples that people cite of famous athletes, giving out that kind of advice or receiving that kind of advice. Then you get into this, as like people like Tim Noakes and whatever have identified this, the Gatorade-led era, where we started encouraging athletes to drink. Research was ploughed into it. A lot of it was off the back of early profits made off sports drinks. And obviously there's like an inherent there's an inherent pull there to publish stuff and display stuff that makes sports drinks look good. And the fact that the more we should drink, we should drink more, that's better. There's this famous ad, I think it was around about late 90s, that Gatorade put up saying, if you're drinking less than like 40 something ounces an hour, your performance will suffer. Like kind of messaging which suggested you should be drinking over a litre an hour as an athlete. And like you said, you were probably competing at a similar time when I was competing and studying, and the message was always like the message that you kind of internalized from all of this noise was like, I've got to be drinking more because dehydration is such a problem. So we went from this like don't drink to almost drink as much as you can, and as you rightly identified, being an athlete, more is always better. That's just a given. So there's this over drinking, and that's where people like Noakes and Christine's identified it in her book as well. There was a sort of a perverse set of circumstances and motives around pushing sports drinks really, really hard. And then what we've seen in the last 10 years or so, really, since Noakes published the book called Waterlogged, is a bit of a push from certain corners the other way to go back and say, hang on a minute, hydration or dehydration has been over demonized and hydration's been over promoted. So what we've got now is hopefully some kind of a movement back towards a bit more of a middle ground. But I still feel like the argument is quite polarized and quite extreme, because you've still got people that push drinking pretty hard, as if it's the be all and end all. And then you've still got a lot of people who are saying, actually, we're going to go back the other way. And Noakes particularly has been quite adamant about, just drink a little bit, just drink when you're thirsty. Don't worry about it. You'll be fine. It's kind of a blanket catch-all message. And our position on that, if you like, or where I've come at it from, has been trying to tease out the middle ground of, there are a lot of occasions where hydration's been over-promoted and over-pushed, and people have been encouraged to drink sports drinks in particular, but just drink in general when it's unnecessary. But when at some point, I always think about it like a continuum. Like at one end, you've got times when you just don't need to drink as an athlete. And they're obviously like shorter, cooler events, people with lower sweat rates. The human body can go pretty well for quite a while without drinking. But if you go right to the other end and go to, say, the Hawaii Ironman or whatever, when the top guys and girls are smashing around for 8 or 9 hours with incredible sweat rates, high power outputs, pace, and that sort of thing, the amount of attention they have to pay to hydrating, you don't see many or any, in fact, really, of those guys just drinking a little bit of water when they're thirsty. They're consuming high volumes of fluid, they're consuming a lot of electrolytes, maybe with carbohydrates as well, and they're doing that, a lot of them, to some sort of like plan or strategy. And then in between those two extremes, you've got a point at which people need to be more strategic, but it's quite a slow transition, and it depends a lot on lots of different variables, all of which leads it to not being very conducive to produce a snappy one-liner about, because the snappy one-liner is like, drink as much as you can tolerate, only drink water when you're thirsty. They're never going to encompass the whole argument. So it's a case of like breaking it down and going, okay, we've got to look at the person, we've got to look at the individual, their physiology, and we've got to look at the situation they're in. And maybe for a lot of those people, we can say, actually, hydration isn't going to be it's not going to be a huge limiter or a huge challenge that we need to overcome. We can drink when we're thirsty. We can listen to our instincts and get on with the rest of our life, But at some point, I certainly found, and this is where I have to admit my own biases, but I certainly found that when I thought about my hydration, researched it and got it right, it was a complete game changer for me as an athlete. And so if I exist towards that more extreme end of like needing to work to a plan and needing to understand my hydration requirements very specifically and meet them, and other people don't, I think everyone sort of sits somewhere between those two. I mean, it's a kind of a convoluted answer to your question, but that's where we end up, this continuum idea.
No, I think the continuum's it's a clear concept, and I've sketched one out here on my notes, which just says on the far left, short plus cool, and on the far right, long plus hot, and then a little dash in the middle with an arrow saying be more strategic as you go towards those hot conditions / longer durations. And where do you think, Andy, the threshold, which is, of course, as you say, we've got to consider the person's physiology and the situation they're in, but as an arbitrary sort of guide, a duration of what requires a bit more strategy. I've read or researched here that up to 90 minutes can be tolerated quite well. What do you feel as a bit of an arbitrary guide? So
there's a few caveats before you get into that, I reckon. And the biggest one probably is like, well, do we start exercise well hydrated? Because I think if you start exercise really well hydrated, optimally hydrated, then for a lot of people, unless conditions are really extreme, super hot and humid, or unless you've got a savagely high sweat rate, which we occasionally see, then 90 minutes, you're right, sort of, in the 60 to 90 minute region, there might be a bit of an argument for having a drink available in case you feel a bit thirsty and want to drink, but it's unlikely. If you go to the other side of the question, is dehydration likely to catastrophically derail your performance? Like, no. So for a lot of people, competitive runners, for example, that's going to mean that half marathons and that kind of thing are at that point where you might take a drink later on. Most of the elites won't, or they won't drink a significant amount, but that sort of zone, anything much below that, and your aim has got to be, okay, I'm going to turn up and start hydrated, but I'm not going to worry too much about what I'm consuming during, because hydration is not going to be my big limiter. you get to the kind of like 90 minutes, 2 hours and a bit longer. And I think certainly if conditions are warm to hot or humid and you've got a decent sweat rate, then that's where it starts to rear its head. So if you're a runner, that's running marathons. If you're a triathlete, it's going significantly beyond the Olympic distance. It's in those instances when actually, you might want to pay more attention. There are other variables like the temperature obviously does matter, because we've worked with a lot of Ironman athletes, and we worked with one guy called Alan Hovda, who's won the Norseman triathlon in in Norway a few times, and he won it in cold conditions, drinking entirely to thirst. On like Tim Noakes's he read the Noakes book and followed that and thought that was fantastic. Wrote a blog post about it, which I happened to comment on and just say I'm not sure I agree with this, entirely. And then a couple of years later, Alan came full circle and came back round to see us because he'd done Ironman Texas and tried to drink water to thirst and ended up in the medical tent. And we've had lots of like pretty constructive discussions, and he works quite closely with us now about understanding what is that point at which you need to be more strategic. So there's that interplay of like, the ambient temperature with the duration. And then I think layered on top of that, you've got level of experience, because an athlete that's super experienced kind of intuitively learns how much they need to drink, and they become really good at reading their own body. It's exactly the same as the way an athlete that's very experienced learns to pace themselves. Because I'm sure, you're an experienced athlete, but if you went out and wanted to run 10 miles at a pretty even pace, you could do it. But if you tell someone who's not really done much running before to try to hold an even pace, their pacing is often all over the shop, because they aren't reading that biofeedback very well of what they can actually physically do. So I think that, again, I may be slightly starting off with overcomplicating it, but up to that, I'd agree with you in saying up to that 90-minute-ish threshold, if you start well hydrated, hydration's not the biggest issue you're going to face, for sure. So you don't need to worry too much. Beyond that, in this sort of 2 to 3, 4 hour window, it becomes more important, and you start going beyond 4 or 5 hours. And I think it's actually really quite important to understand what you might want to be replacing.
And once again, just intuitively, I don't think there'd be too many people that would argue with that in terms of it as a concept. Just out of interest, Andy, the athlete there, Alan, I think you mentioned his name, was he ended up in the medical tent. What did he end up in the medical tent with or due to? It was
basically, they didn't take a lot of blood samples and things like that as far as I'm aware, but it was kind of a combination of like heat illness, either dehydration or hyponatremia or a combination thereof, because he said that he just got to this point where he's like boiling over, feeling fatigued and dizzy and weak, and just he wanted to throw himself in the river. Basically, he was running alongside a river, I think he said, and he wanted to jump in there. So and I've felt like that in hot races. And I know that people like Noakes and some of the people that have worked with him have attacked a lot of these assumptions that, like, in the past, dehydration, for example, has been lumped in with heat stroke and heat exhaustion as kind of a causative effect or whatever. And quite often it's been pretty well proven that those two things can happen independently. A lot of heat stroke and heat exhaustion cases happen in shorter races where people's metabolic rate's really high and they're not dehydrated. But also, I think it's naive to then sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that in longer and hotter events, we know that blood volume is like hugely impactful on the ability to cool, because you can sweat more when your blood volume's high. You can pump more blood to the surface of the skin to dissipate heat, and sort of like countering that dehydration has nothing to do with dehydration has nothing to do with heat illness is probably also like a bit of an extreme view, not necessarily a naive view, but it's kind of an extreme view to make a point. It's not the only factor that's at play. An
incomplete view. Because, as you say, if blood volume does go down, there'll be less blood available to cool the, to cool this for the skin and evaporation, etc. So it's not as cut and dry, I guess, as you say in there, Andy, to say that dehydration is not linked at all to potential heat illness. I remember as a junior triathlete running out when I was maybe 10 or 11, our local club race, it was extremely hot. And one of the senior experienced women, it was a bike riding next to me. I remember she said, make sure he drinks a lot so he doesn't get heat stroke. And I remember thinking, that doesn't sound good. I better drink a lot. So I probably ended up hyponatremic at the end.
Yeah. I mean, and you're right. That's the problem, and the reason I think why Noakes wrote Waterlogged and why people have got on that bandwagon is entirely, in one respect, like well intentioned, because there's all these myths about like, oh, in the heat you've got to drink loads, and this is so. Going back to my example of doing the World Championships, the Nice long distance triathlon. I think it was about 2002, 2003. It's hot there. I was drinking loads of water in the days leading up to the race because I was paranoid about getting dehydrated, and then drinking tons of water on the bike because, again, my performance is starting to struggle. So I automatically assume I'm not drinking enough, and I'm drinking more and more. And I drank myself hyponatremic, where you dilute your blood sodium levels down. And then, that's a horrible place to be for an athlete, and not all that uncommon. Although thankfully we only see a relatively small amount of deaths from it, even though any death from it is like one too many. We only see a few. We see 10% of finishes in Ironman races and marathons, when you look at the stats that have been published, are often hyponatremic. And whilst some of that's attributable to over drinking, some of it's to do with sweat loss and drinking, and it's a very common thing. So Noakes and people like that taking this stance to say, well, actually athletes, you need to just drink when you're thirsty and drink less, is, I guess, pretty honorably directed at trying to cut down on those cases. But it's when it's taken to the extreme, and it's like, well, that's all you need to do. Like, I'd agree that if you drink to thirst and only drink a little bit of water, you're not going to get hyponatremia, because by definition you can't. You're going to lose more fluid than sodium, and you're going to end up hypernatremic, not hyponatremic. But that's not the same as being compatible with optimum performance, because we know everything we know about exercise physiology dictates that keeping your blood volume up is a critical part of endurance performance. So if you don't drink enough to keep your blood volume up, then you're going to start to slow down in other ways. So it's that balancing act. So
once again, it's not so black and white. There's that continuum to consider where you need to be more strategic versus following a one-line maxim of drinking to thirst purely. And there's that 2002 Boston research, 2002 Boston analysis, where there were 13% of the finishers that were found to be hyponatremic, which is quite a lot, right? And I guess the concern there is that symptoms can be paralleled with those of dehydration: weakness, headaches, nausea, dizziness, lightheadedness. And I reflect and think I've probably had hyponatremia in quite a few events, in the earlier days.
Yeah, I reckon certainly going back a few years, and certainly in a lot of athletes that are quite committed to getting plenty of fluid in, it actually is probably more common than people realise, and that's one of the things we do when we consult with athletes that come to us because they reckon they're having problems about hydration. Although we're we're seen as, because we one of the things that we do as a company is we make sports drinks. We're very keen to impress on athletes that actually sometimes it'll be reducing the volume that they drink will be the strategy that will help them perform more rather than increasing it. It's just that there's not a blanket one way or the other move. It's dependent on individual circumstance.
Yeah, individual. And just to summarise today, we're talking about drinking to thirst. Will probably keep you okay for up to a certain duration, or depending on your experience and your physiology, which can include your sweat rate, which we want to touch on or discuss. And then there's the alternative, which is drinking to a schedule, which is something that isn't without its pitfalls as well. So if we dive a bit deeper here, Andy, we'll come back to starting hydrated and some strategies around that. But I think it's a good time to explore this concept of sweating. Every athlete knows that they sweat. Some would identify that or believe they sweat a lot. I really enjoyed an experience recently where your Gold Coast sweat expert, Phil, took me in for a sweat test. And in my head, I thought, right, well, I'm going to need to... I'd actually had surgery the day before on a little lipoma on the side of my hip, and I thought, well, that might not work because I'm probably going to need to run or ride. But it was quite novel that it was a rest-in sweat test. So before we look at how to assess the sweat rate of an athlete, Andy, or discuss that, the physiology of sweat, can you do a little bit of an unpacking, if you like, of what sweat is and what role it plays and why it matters so much?
Yeah, for sure. It's a good place to start. And sweating is the best way your body has to cool down when it gets hot. So the reason for that is that when sweat evaporates from your skin, when the water evaporates away, it takes a lot of heat energy away with it, far more than you can just radiate out into the environment. It's exactly why if you can go in a swimming pool on a warm day, get out and instantly feel quite chilly, especially if it's breezy, because that water evaporates away really quick, takes a lot of heat with it, and then as soon as you're dry, you can feel the warmth again. So sweating is that hugely efficient way for you to shed heat, and it's actually like a human superpower, because not many other mammals sweat, and those that do, most don't sweat as much as we do. So we kind of sweat more, and that's to do with evolutionary biology and the fact that we evolved in a hot, dry climate and needed to survive in the heat of the day. And then when you sweat, the sweat that's produced comes from your blood. So it comes from the blood plasma, and it comes from the capillary beds in your bloodstream. The sweat, the fluid moves into sweat glands and then is excreted onto the surface of the skin. And that's all kind of centrally controlled by the hypothalamus in your brain. So the hypothalamus is detecting how hot your body's getting. It's like a thermostat in your house. It's a certain threshold temperature. It clicks on, sends out neurotransmitters to the sweat glands that pull sweat in and push it out onto the skin, and that evaporates away. So you're effectively, all the time you're sweating, you're reducing your blood volume. So that's why we often talk about like sweat, hydration, and blood volume together, because they're very, very interdependent. And the reason that your sweat is largely water, but there's quite a lot of electrolytes in it. And the key electrolyte, we talked about hyponatremia, and hyponatremia is low sodium levels in the blood. And part of the reason why athletes can be more susceptible to hyponatremia is because we can lose quite a large amount of sodium in our sweat. So your blood is very salty. There's a lot of sodium chloride in there, and we lose a lot of sodium and a lot of chloride in our sweat. So blood is about 3,600 milligrams of sodium in every litre, and sweat can be anywhere from sort of 200 to 2,000 milligrams of sodium per litre. And that's why the sweat test that you did with Phil recently was looking at not how much you sweated, but it was actually looking at the content of the sweat. So it was looking at the electrolyte levels. And what we found from testing the sweat of lots and lots of athletes is that sodium level in sweat is pretty stable for an individual athlete, but can be wildly variable between athletes. And I think from memory, your test result was on the lower side. So like you were losing maybe, 500 or 600 milligrams of sodium?
512 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat.
Yeah, so that's a pretty dilute sweat. That's on the lower end of the bell curve that we would see if we tested 100 people. I'm up on the other end, so my sweat consistently measures 1,800 milligrams of sodium per litre. And I must have had, over the years now, obviously through what I do, hundreds of sweat tests. So in every litre of sweat, we can presume that I'm losing, at least, if not a little bit more than 3 times the amount of sodium that you are. And so that, for me, going back to the start of this conversation, that was one of the key bits of information that when I learned that my sweat was that concentrated, Dr. Jutley was saying to me, look, if that holds true when you're exercising, then we're going to need to replace tons more sodium, which is going to then be absorbed to get back into your bloodstream and keep your blood volume up. Because if you don't, you're just going to dilute yourself, or you've been just diluting yourself with water. And so for me, that was the piece of information that unlocked it. And obviously it needs to be overlaid with a bit of knowledge about how much you sweat, because although sweat sodium composition is variable, sweat rates are also variable, But people are a bit more au fait with that, because sometimes you go running with someone and you're soaked and they're dry, or vice versa. And that's just genetic differences in, sweat rates. So yeah, understanding sweat sodium composition and sweat rate is like the gateway to starting to unlock this as an individual.
And I think that's such a key distinction, is the difference between sweat concentration and sweat rate, because I think, as you say, it's easy to run alongside a peer, a training buddy, and just say, well, you're a big sweater. And but those two athletes don't necessarily have the same sweat concentration. I might run alongside you, Andy, and have a low concentration as the test showed, but you're on the triple the sweat concentration. So looping that back to this continuum idea, your physiology is very different to mine, even if we're going the same duration and in same intensity, right? So your needs are naturally going to be different.
Definitely. And that's where we start to see, like, in an hour, you and I could probably run for an hour together, and the net loss of fluid and sodium between us would be relatively negligible. But you start to then multiply that, but there'd be a difference. And then, but you start going for 4 hours or 5 hours. So, just picking arbitrary numbers, if we both sweated a litre an hour and you're losing 500 milligrams of sodium and I'm losing 1800, then in 3 hours, you're only going to lose 1500 milligrams. But I'm already approaching 5,500 milligrams of sodium, which is more than, if I eat by the government guidelines, that's more than I'm going to consume in a day. So it's easy to see how over a number of hours those things diverge and create these massive inter-individual differences. And your physiology, from what we've measured, and mine are quite illustrative of that, because we sit closer to the extremes. Like a lot of people we measure, there's a bell curve of this sort of distribution, same as there is with height and other physiological factors. The average sweat sodium composition we see is about 900 milligrams, between 900 and 1,000 milligrams per litre. And at the really low end, it'll be like 200, and we've occasionally seen people over 2,000. So it's quite a broad spread. And
Andy, in your circumstance, prior to this knowledge that you have, and now you coach athletes through with some of the great tools that you offer, you said you were diluting yourself more. So if you break that down, you were taking, say, water on without, yet you were losing so much salt. So what was the physiological flow onto that, and how does that affect your blood plasma and then the cardiovascular effects and therefore performance? Can you just join the dots so that we're all clear on that sequence? Well,
your body works really hard with its homeostatic mechanisms to keep everything in balance, in harmony, like it does with your temperature and whatever else. But in your blood, one of the key factors it tries to maintain is a stable blood sodium level, somewhere between 135 and 145 millimoles. So when you sweat a little bit and you drink some water, you kind of absorb it into your bloodstream and in the gut, and your body finds ways to balance that out, either by then filtering water out and peeing out of the kidneys, or reabsorbing more sodium, to make up the deficit. But when we sweat a lot and we really lose a lot of fluid really fast and a lot of electrolytes really fast, if we, for instance, like for me, if I'm losing, let's say, 1,800 milligrams of sodium in every litre of sweat, but I'm pouring water back in at a rapid rate, which for me might be, 1.2 litres an hour during exercise, then very, very quickly, not only am I losing that salt more quickly than I can reabsorb it from anywhere, I'm also adding water into the bloodstream, which is diluting it down. So I end up with a blood plasma sodium level which is suboptimal, which is dropping below 135. And the danger with that when you're exercising is that in normal day-to-day life, when you overdrink, or when your blood starts to become too dilute, your kidneys will filter out water and your wee and get everything back into normal. But when you're exercising, you often, you release hormones that stop you from peeing. You therefore retain the fluid, and the body sort of shifts fluid from the blood volume into the cells. So it moves it from the extracellular compartment into the intracellular compartment. And that's why people with hyponatremia can appear a little bit swollen and puffy and kind of blown up, swollen fingers, swollen ankles, swollen hands, because they're sponging up water to stop it from diluting their blood. And if it gets really bad, it goes into your brain. And that's what causes the big problems with hyponatremia. Like people get headaches and they have seizures, they go into coma and even die if they damage their brain because it swells up inside the skull. So it does some pretty nasty neurological damage if it goes unchecked. And that's why, conversely, by adding a reasonable level of sodium into your drinks when you're losing a lot of salt makes so much sense, because you absorb that sodium in through the gut into the bloodstream with the water. It helps to keep homeostasis more balanced. It helps to keep that blood sodium level in check. You don't end up shunting loads of fluid into the intracellular space. You keep your blood volume up and you keep smashing on, feeling good at whatever activity you're doing. And like I said, for me, that difference was clear, because when I was previously doing events, I had the perception of becoming dehydrated and like drinking a lot, but it was all sloshing around in my belly and I was feeling sick and just lethargic. When I put enough salt back in with it, then it would get absorbed, my stomach would clear, I would feel like I could keep powering on. It was just such a difference. And with all interestingly, a lot of the people who advocate for like not needing to take sodium or wanting to take sodium in sport, they tend to kind of gloss over that bit and say, oh well, you can just drink a bit of water and you'll absorb what you need and you won't what you won't. Whereas all the medical practitioners I talk to who are used to measuring blood volume and monitoring blood volume in patients are always like, well, when you lose lots of fluid, we have to put salty fluid back in, either in the form of an IV or an oral rehydration solution for people to drink. So it just is odd the way there's this divide between, people with that medical knowledge about maintaining blood volume from a medical perspective with people who are in hospital, compared with, say, this more sort of like extreme view in sport where it's the all or nothing. It's either we're all in with sports drinks or we're all out with them.
It's quite polarized in opinion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And in my professional work as a sports physio, it's certainly one thing that whenever there's the polarized views, it's normally sometimes fraught with danger clinically. It's normally that middle ground where there's the truth that lies.
Yeah.
And Andy, just to really drive home this importance of blood plasma volume. So when we sweat, the blood plasma volume drops, but how low can that get? I mean, obviously the body's going to regulate that to try and stop catastrophe.
Yeah.
Is there any insight into that? Like how low can that blood plasma volume actually get to before, I guess, I'm not sure what would happen.
Yeah, well, I think that the body's got the body will prioritize like the maintenance of blood volume when you're exercising. So even if you're not drinking, it's able to maintain it to an extent because it can take fluid the opposite way from the intracellular compartment and move it into the extracellular space to keep blood volume up. So I think I couldn't put my hat in the ring with any numbers as to how much, what percentage of blood volume you could see decline, because I don't know how extensively that's been studied. But I know that you can infer that a lot of athletes finish events with lower blood volume than they start, partly because they finish like with hyponatremic, so they would finish with higher blood sodium levels, because that's kind of an indirect indicator that your blood volume's reduced, because you've lost more fluid compared with the solutes, and therefore your blood's showing up as more concentrated.
Yep.
The other thing is as well, they are often successful athletes finish events a little bit dehydrated in terms of body weight loss. So we know that if they weighed X amount at the start line, they've lost a bit of weight by the finish line, because the hyponatremic athletes tend to be often, or can often be, the ones that have maintained or gained body weight, because that's a sign of over drinking. But what the exact sort of like fluid balance situation is between intracellular and extracellular in those cases is probably hard to say, because I know that a lot of, there've been some pretty extreme cases of marathon runners like Haile Gebrselassie cited for losing 10% of their body weight during an event, which is an extremely high amount of body weight drop during a marathon, but still performing well at the end and still visibly walking around, looking as good as anyone can expect to when you've just run, 2:04 for a marathon.
Yeah.
those guys, whilst we can infer from that they're pretty dehydrated, it would be really interesting to know that what their blood volume's like, because I would suspect that a lot of that fluid loss has been kind of sucked through from the intracellular space. So if you took a measurement of intracellular versus extracellular dehydration, it would show in both, but their intracellular stores would probably be pretty rinsed, along with their glycogen stores and everything else. So that's what accounts for, I think, a big part of the body weight deficit.
Andy, the formula, I think it's worth just popping this up. Sweat concentration times sweat rate times duration equals your net losses. So can we just explore this? Let's start with sweat concentration. I had the static sweat test. I was intrigued, and initially I was trying to think back to my exercise physiology days at uni, the sweat test that I think we may have done back then was an active one. So this was quite novel, the rest in sweat test. How does that work? How can it be accurate? Obviously, if you're not exercising, that's the natural thought.
Well, the way that sweat's stimulated naturally in the body is that your hypothalamus detects that you're getting hot. It sends a cascade of neurotransmitters down the line. The terminal neurotransmitter that acts on the sweat gland is acetylcholine, and that tells the sweat gland to produce sweat. And then what we use to do a sweat test now is a piece of technology that was originally designed for the diagnostics of cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic disease. And people with CF exhibit very high salt loss in sweat. But it's often diagnosed in small children and babies because it becomes apparent soon after birth if they're showing symptoms of it. And you can't get a young baby or a toddler even to exercise to the extent where they would produce enough sweat to collect it. So it was innovated in the sort of 70s, 80s, a way of stimulating the sweat glands with a chemical that acts it's an analog for acetylcholine. It's called pilocarpine. You put it into the skin. That's what filtered to you with some electrodes. You put some electrodes on your arm, stimulated the sweat glands. So the sweat glands kind of don't know whether you're hot or not, but what they do know is that they've been told to sweat. So the mechanism, although it's very slightly different, it's essentially analogous to what happens when you get hot. Sweat's produced. It's produced at quite a rapid rate in the small area that's stimulated. So we get sweat into this little device, collect up the sweat, and analyze it. Yeah, so there've been some valid arguments around whether the sweat that you collect from chemical stimulation of the sweat glands is the same as the sweat that you collect through exercising. And although there is a bit of back and forth that constantly goes on about that, what I can say is that in my experience of working with athletes, collecting sweat during exercise, collecting sweat through this sort of stimulated method, is that you get, if not exactly the same results all the time, you get very, very similar results. So if we tested you at 500 odd milligrams of sodium loss in your sweat, if we did multiple tests, and if we did multiple tests during exercise and other methods, as long as we take the sweat from the same part of the body and we're consistent about a number of things, we kind of, I would, be entirely surprised if we saw your number jump around more than, if you were less than 450 milligrams on a regular basis and more than 650, which essentially categorizes you as someone who just has a relatively low amount of sodium in your sweat. And there are occasions when knowing the exact amount of sodium in sweat is necessary and useful. Like if you're conducting a certain type of lab study and you want to really drill into someone's physiology to the nth degree. But for an athlete, what I took from the process of doing a sweat test all those years ago was just that, look, my result just showed I was super high in salt loss. And we've taken an approach with pH, with the athletes we work with, is trying to kind of categorizing them as someone who's like low, medium, high, or very high, and then trying to put strategies in place around, what works for people in those categories, as opposed to worrying too much about the fine detail. It's a bit like having shirts that come in small, medium, large, and extra large, rather than tailor making an individual suit for everyone. I think that's an unnecessary level of detail.
That makes sense. So we're talking about sweat concentration testing. Just out of interest, are there in the exercise physiology world, are there set dynamic tests that are done, or is there a myriad of ways that could be collected dynamically, noting that the difference between the test that I had done, the static one and the dynamic ones, are probably fairly negligible in the outcomes, but just out of interest.
Yeah, most people keep it where they can, keep it sport specific. So, you know, you would tend to like run around or cycle or do whatever the sport is. Obviously for swimmers, it's difficult or almost impossible because you're in water and collecting sweat from that situation is almost impossible. But you often find that it's like running on a treadmill, sitting on a static bike, or if you're really trying to do field research, you put patches on someone's body while they run around and play soccer or rugby or whatever. Collect the patches in, squeeze the sweat out of them, and then analyze it. So it's pretty like basic stuff. Although to do it really well takes quite a lot of skill because it's easy to get contamination in the little sweat patches. It's easy for fluid to evaporate and for the samples to look too concentrated, which is one of the big reasons why we wanted to go with a kind of a lab-based standard. Although it potentially has its own weaknesses, the one strength that it has is very repeatable results no matter who's doing the test.
And I'm going to pop some photos up of my test on my Instagram gallery and in the show notes if people are interested in what the technology looked like.
Yeah.
And so that's sweat concentration. It's an important part, as you've highlighted. I'm low, you're high. We're going to have very different needs. Sweat rate. Andy, how does an athlete get a concept of their sweat rate?
The sweat rate's probably the easiest one that people can do themselves, because to get an estimate of your sweat rate, you can easily weigh yourself before and after a training session or even a race if you've got the capacity to, and look at the difference in weight. And fundamentally, the amount of weight that you've lost will be very similar to the amount of fluid that you've lost. So for every litre of fluid you lose in sweat, you'll lose about 1 kilo of body weight. Obviously, if you drink something during that session, you just have to note that down and then subtract that from the answer so that you don't, it gets taken into account. But basically, the amount of weight loss is analogous to the amount of fluid loss. And if people want to do that, we've got a spreadsheet on our website, which I can link you to, a little blog it's called How to Measure Your Sweat Rate. And it takes you through the steps. And what we advise people to do is if you're going to do that, it's kind of it's an interesting exercise to do it once. But where it's really valuable is to do it quite a few times in a number of different conditions, in different temperatures and different intensities, and build up a bit of a picture of what your level of sweat loss is like. Because those results, those data points are kind of, they will often have a little bit of inherent error in them, just in the way you've measured it or whatever. It's not a perfectly accurate test, but if you do it enough times, the noise tends to cancel itself out and you get a picture. Again, what we're looking to figure out is, like with the sweat concentration, is not exactly how many milliliters of sweat you lose, but just, are you someone who's a low, medium, high or very high sweater?
You're listening to Andy Blow, sports scientist, founder of Precision Hydration, on this expert edition around all things hydration science. Support for today's show comes from our upcoming October live stream event with Associate Professor Dr. Shona Halson. Now, the topic for this live stream is recovery. Shona is famous for having quoted, "The only training we are benefiting from is the training we are recovering from." And during this 3-hour live stream, Recovery Essentials for Optimal Performance, Shona will cover 4 modules: fundamentals of recovery, recovery periodization and adaptation, sleep science, recovery science, Mythbusters, and bonus Q&A time. Tickets to the live stream are just $49 and include post-event recording and a live stream workbook. To secure your ticket to this upcoming live stream learning opportunity, jump over to pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Shona Halson live stream. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest, Andy Blow, sports scientist on all things hydration science. Andy, curiosity question, is sweat rate consistent, say in the case of a triathlete, across each of the disciplines? Or do some people have a higher sweat rate with, the run compared to the swim? I mean, it's hard, as you say, in the swim, but is it?
Depends on a lot of factors like water temperature with swimming, or wetsuit or non-wetsuit, and these kind of things. But generally speaking, you would see lower sweat rates in swimming, slightly higher in cycling, and then higher again in running. And some of that's got to do with the fact that, like on the bike, obviously you're getting more airflow at a higher speed, so the sweating that you do is slightly more efficient, so you're losing a bit more heat as a result. For a lot of people, especially in the longer distance triathlons, quite often you start early in the morning, so it tends to be cooler when you're out on the bike, and then by the time you get to the run, especially if you're doing a half or a full Ironman, you might be running in the heat of the day, which makes a huge difference. I'd say between running and cycling, it can be a lot closer, because especially if you're fit, your metabolic rate on the bike can be pretty high. So but it would tend to increase a little bit. But that's why it's kind of a good idea for athletes to measure it. If you're a triathlete, especially, you want to measure it in biking and running, really, to get a good picture at race intensity and race temperature. I would say for triathletes specifically, and often we get asked this question a lot by Ironman and half Ironman athletes, I would say the most important thing to understand is probably your sweat output on the bike, because that's where you do a lot of your hydrating to set yourself up for later in the race. So getting much closer to meeting what you're losing on the bike is important to set yourself up for a good marathon. So that's where you'd focus a lot of your attention.
Yeah, key learnings, and that's great information, Andy. Andy, we've covered here sweat concentration, how to get estimates or indeed accurate measures through a test like I've had, sweat rate, and we're looking at countering the net losses, monitoring hydration status. It seems to be, as I delved slightly into some of the literature research, that many people have been kind of sold a little bit of a lie about the importance of their urine hue or the colour of your urine. The old oversimplification: if it's clear, you're right, and if it's dark and you're not right, you're dehydrated. Maybe it's not the case.
Well, not always, I think, and probably again, you and I were probably brought up in that era where if you were told, check your pee, and I still go into sports teams nowadays where they have the big urine colour charts above the urinals, telling people, and I saw one not that long ago where basically it kind of called your character into question if your urine was dark. It was like, you're letting your team down, you're letting everyone down if your urine's this colour, and I think it was quite extreme. And but yeah, it's a pervasive myth, if you like. I think the thing about urine colour is when you first get up in the morning and you go for a pee, the colour of the first pee that you have can be quite indicative of your general hydration state, because your body's had time to sort itself out overnight. You've not interfered with it with caffeine or other diuretics, and the colour of that when you urinate is probably a decent indication or approximation of your hydration status. Once you get much beyond that and you start drinking and doing stuff in the day, you actually if your urine is clear, what that is fundamentally telling you is that for whatever reason your body is getting rid of water. So it often can be a sign that you're reasonably well hydrated, because one thing that shows in is, if you've got plenty of water on board, you'll pee more out. But the influence of like diuretics like tea and coffee, caffeine or alcohol, foods that you eat, different ways that people respond to exercise and hormonal fluctuations and things all play a role, and obviously interfere with that. And I think one of the biggest things that athletes do in like chasing wanting to have clear pee all the time is they end up over drinking to achieve that, because that's kind of a catch-up. Because what we do know is if you overdrink, you will have clear pee. It doesn't always mean that you're well hydrated, and that maybe even you're not heading for hyponatremia. No. And
then the dark urine in the morning, the dark urine, Andy, could mean that you're just running low on fluid, or that the kidneys are keeping things in check by conserving water. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's not necessarily a bad sign in and of itself. I mean, if it was very dark and you're feeling thirsty and all that kind of thing, and you did a big session or had a big race the day before, then you want to put more than one piece of information together. There's a great paper been written a few years ago. I can't remember the name of the author off the top of my head, but they looked at this trifecta of things, and they called it the WUT, which was the weight, urine, and thirst dynamic. And they drew it as a Venn diagram with the three overlapping circles. And essentially what it was indicating was when you first get up in the morning, if your body weight's down a little bit, from the day before, if you're feeling thirsty and your urine colour is dark, that's a really powerful message that you're likely to be a bit dehydrated, and you should probably do something about that if you're going to go and exercise that day, because you're already starting behind. Sometimes though, your urine can be dark, and like you say, your kidneys are just conserving a bit of fluid, and actually your hydration state is pretty reasonable. So if you're not thirsty and if your body weight's not down, then there's not a great rationale to think, shit, my urine's really dark, I've got to drink loads because I'm horribly dehydrated. It's not as simple as that, basically.
I like that, the WUT approach, weight, urine and thirst, and marrying those up. Andy, if we delve into some of these countering the loss strategies through hydration, maybe just touch on pre-hydration. You mentioned it earlier on, and the importance of starting with a good blood plasma volume. And prior featured expert Dan Plews, Hawaii Ironman, current age group world record holder, he did a great job of outlining why, for countering the effects of heat, you want to start topped up with your hydration state. So what strategies can we deploy to ensure we do start, if we're going on one of these long events, say we're going an Ironman or a 70.3 or an ultra run, for example, what could we do to make sure we're ready to go?
I would say the first thing not to do is just drink loads of water, because that's the instinct that most people have, is just to drink more and more. And whilst it probably is prudent to drink a little bit more in the days leading up to a big event, that might be a glass or two extra of water, with meals or throughout the day. It's not just walking around with a 2-litre bottle and just constantly glugging from it, because what you start to do in that instance is you will start peeing clear, but you'll be flushing out a lot of electrolytes, and you'll be starting the descent into hyponatremia, basically, if you're not careful. So what I would say is, like, a little bit of extra water in the days building up, and probably, if sometimes a little bit of extra salt on your food is not harmful, because although salt's been demonized in a lot of recent years, it's that extra sodium will help you retain a bit more of the fluid that you're taking on board. So, because your body will recognize that it needs to balance that sodium out, you're going to hold on to a bit more. And then in the final 24 hours before a big event, what we advise athletes to do is have a really strong electrolyte drink. We make one called pH 1500, which has got 1500 milligrams of sodium in every litre. And we advise athletes to have a strong drink like that the night before the event, and if it's an early start, and then another one about an hour before the start. And when I say one, that's usually about 300 to 500 millilitres of that. So it's not a huge quantity, but that just ensures that you're going to get a bit of extra sodium, some extra fluid on board. You get an hour then to kind of go to the bathroom if you need to and pee out any excess, and you're going to be properly topped up. But it's not the thing about fluid loading, if you like, is it's not like carbo loading. We haven't got a vast capacity to take on extra in the days building up. You just want to make sure you're staying normally hydrated, and then a little tiny boost at the end with some extra electrolytes to really hold on to the fluid.
Gosh, when you said walking around with a 2-litre bottle, it literally, I hadn't thought of this for 20 odd years, but it took me back to the green 2-litre Gatorade bottles. And we used to carry them into transition areas. So, gosh, that was a flashback. Andy, all right, so we've covered getting on the start line, fueling through the event, and let's say we're talking obviously about this, where you need to be strategic and drink to some sort of schedule or a plan, or have a bit of a strategy in place versus just drinking to thirst. So possibly going long and hot, for example. Can you touch on the difference between the different types of drink formulas that are available and the pitfalls that can occur with what I believe to be really highly concentrated formulations of carbohydrates?
Yeah, a lot of traditional sports drinks were and still are kind of quite carbohydrate heavy, because when you're exercising, there's three things that athletes fundamentally need to be ingesting to keep the performance up, and one of them is carbs. That's probably one of the most important when you're exercising hard and for a long time, because you run out of muscle glycogen. You need water to replace what you're losing in sweat. And if you're going for long enough, or it's hot enough, or your sweat sodium level is high enough, you need sodium as well. And those three things are what you need to put back in. And so a traditional sports drink has quite a bit of carbohydrate, some water, and a little bit of electrolytes. So it's kind of a jack of all trades. And for shorter and higher intensity events, they're probably not a bad choice, because they just give you that little bit of what you need. They're very digestible. They're very easy to consume. Job done. When you start going for longer events, though, we often see athletes getting GI issues being a big thing that trips up their performances. And often that can be an excess of sugary drinks, because they just overwhelm the stomach. There's too much sugar. If you're really thirsty on a hot day, you could, for instance, drink, 2 or 3 bottles of this sort of stuff per hour. And that's a hell of a lot of carbohydrate. These things have often got 35, 40 grams of carbohydrates in. That's really pushing the upper end of what your body can tolerate, especially if you then layer that on top with gels or energy bars or something. So the drinks that we make and that we advise athletes to use when they're consuming large volumes or when it's hot are hypotonic, as opposed to those other types being isotonic, which is more like the consistency of your blood. The hypotonic ones are a lot thinner and lighter, so they tend to have higher amounts of electrolytes and lower amounts of sugar, if any at all. So we have some products that have got no calories in, and we have some that have about 15 grams of carbohydrate a serving. So there's just a little bit of carbs in there to give a little bit of energy and aid absorption of fluid in the gut, but not enough to overwhelm it. And you can eat more solid foods, which tend to be more easily digested in longer events, and kind of keep everything separate. So we call it 3 levers. You can pull those 3 levers independently: fluids, salts, and carbs. And it tends to result in happier stomachs all round.
Yeah, so interesting. And, there's that adage, which is quite well versed in multi-sport, around carbs in your pocket and fluid in the bottle.
Yeah.
Once again, is it that dichotomous, or is it more middle ground, or do you agree with that sentiment?
I largely would agree with that sentiment. I would say there's always exceptions that prove the rule. And I know athletes that use liquid nutrition almost entirely and get on okay with it, but they tend to be in the minority. I would say if people are having big GI issues, we try and break down and keep it really simple and say, look, ideally you want water, salts, and you want calories, and you want them from, if not from 3 separate places, you want to keep the salts and fluids separate to the calories, so that you can then increase or decrease them on the fly in sort of appreciation of how your body's feeling in terms of what the conditions are doing. Because it can be if it's super hot one day, you might drink 3 times the amount you drink on a cold day, but you're not going to need 3 times the amount of calories. So being able to maneuver those things independently. We're watching the Tour de France at the moment, with the first couple of days being like relatively, it's been raining and stuff. And, one of the teams that we work with there, I'm seeing some of the stats of what's being eaten and drunk. And, the guys are eating a lot and not drinking a lot. But you can bet your bottom dollar when that flips into when the weather changes, or when they go somewhere a lot hotter in the mountains, we're going to see them drinking 3 or 4 times more than what they're drinking on those first couple of stages. And that's just a function of the environment, But if you had all of your calories coming through those bottles, you can't do that, because you can't suddenly not eat anything on the first 2 days just because it's raining. So it's always that, it's a balance. And honestly, the best athletes basically, follow some pretty sensible principles, but they fundamentally figure out what works for them as an individual. And that's the key part. And
the salt, Andy, that could look like a salt tablet.
Yeah, definitely. So in Ironman races, because there weren't a lot of, sort of stronger electrolyte drinks around when I was racing, I ended up taking salt capsules, sodium capsules, and found that, for me, whereas some athletes can get away with, on the lower end, can get away with taking 200, 300, 400 milligrams of sodium an hour, I needed to take, 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of sodium per hour. And the only way to do that reliably was with, salt capsules on the bike. So I would take those, I would take water from the aid stations where I could, and then I'd eat gels and bars. And with the ability to manipulate those 3 factors, I could find a recipe that really worked for me.
And if you're your sweat concentrations on the low scale, is it possible to get enough sodium through one of these hypertonic drink formulas?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I would say there's a lot of them contain, the lower strength drinks out there, like 300 to 500 milligrams of sodium per litre. And if you're someone who's on the lower salt side, you'll probably be absolutely fine with those. We make drinks that are at 250, at 500, at 1,000 and 1,500. And like you'll have seen with the test that you did, we try to give you a recommendation on what's likely to fit best for you. But then the big thing is an encouragement to sort of try some of them out and do some intelligent trial and error, because you can do all of this great theoretical stuff, but at the end of the day, you have to go and try it in anger to see what really works, and then test and adjust from there.
And I've got my hydration plan that I'll be studying and doing just that, Andy, and that is testing and trialing and seeing where I get to. I'm wanting to embark on some long course triathlon in the next decade and make a little foray back into the world of triathlon. So this will be very, very useful.
Excellent. I look forward to hearing how you get on. The good thing is, Brad, if we're going to design someone to sweat, as a triathlete, you'd want them to sweat quite a bit, and you'd want them to have quite a low sodium concentration. So I'm pretty sure you're going to do very well on that basis.
Oh, well, it's very well. It's very, very subjective. And on the salt tablets, is there any risks of having too much salt through a salt tablet? What could happen there, Andy?
Occasionally people do that. I've seen people take a handful of them, which is unwise because it can sort of create a bit of a, you obviously swallow them easy enough, but then they dissolve in your stomach and you're left with a very strong concentration of salt there, which can make you feel pretty queasy and pretty sick. I would say as long as you're taking them at a sensible ratio, and I've talked a little bit about numbers, but really, as far as we're concerned, getting people to understand where they're at with how many milligrams of sodium they need per hour. It could be anywhere, close to zero for some people, or on the low end, and up to probably 1,500 milligrams an hour on the higher end. As long as you're taking them, in relation to what you're sweating out, you're taking some fluid with them. I think that you shouldn't have too many major problems. It's when you just take them ad hoc or take them with not enough fluid that you'll feel a bit sick. Or possibly if you got it really wrong, you might get some diarrhea or something, but that's just because of an excessive concentration in the stomach that the body needs to deal with. But I would say that's rare, especially if you're using them sensibly.
You're listening to Andy Blow, sports scientist, founder of Precision Hydration, on This An Expert edition, exploring all things hydration science. If you missed last week's episode, it was an expert edition on all things the flow state. We talk about it often here on the physical performance show, The Zone, The Flow. They're synonyms. And on last week's expert edition, co-founder of the Flow Research Collective, Rian Doris, shared around how we can use flow triggers to improve the likelihood of ending up in a flow state.
The general academic description is that flow is an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best, and it refers to those moments of total absorption and rapt attention where we get so sucked into the task at hand that everything else melts away. Our sense of time dilates, our sense of self dissipates and goes offline, meaning that voice decreases. Being in that state, we perform our best and we feel our best. It feels bloody great.
To enjoy the full episode, jump back into the show archives, and whilst there, peruse the archives, dating right back to episode 1, featuring Surf Lifesaving Ironman champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest, Andy Blow, sports scientist on all things hydration science. Andy Blow, stage 5 or 6 of the Tour de France is on right now, and as you say, you've got athletes that you're working with in there, so I recognise that you're probably keen to keep an eye on the screen and see how they're tracking. You've been very generous with your contribution and your expertise. We always ask the featured guests, Andy, 2 key questions, and the first is, if you could boil everything you've learnt through your professional career in this space, through your own athletic endeavours, into one single piece of advice, Andy, and let's keep it to hydration science, to help them perform at their best, what would Andy Blow, founder of Precision Hydration, one piece of advice be?
It would have to be that you've got to treat yourself as an individual and not just copy what other people do. Although as athletes, we can learn a lot from other athletes, from coaches, from people around us. The skill, I think, is in taking all of that and synthesizing it into a recipe for the individual that is you, and figuring out, having the confidence and the wherewithal to figure out what works for you as an individual. And I think you can certainly obviously apply that to hydration, but nutrition, training, rehab, whatever it is, you've got to treat yourself as an individual. And once you kind of get on board with that idea, it's very useful. I wish I'd have learned that earlier as an athlete.
Treat yourself as an individual. Powerful. Andy, physical challenge for the week. Every guest issues one. What is Andy Blow's physical challenge to the listeners of this show going to be?
Well, I don't want to offend anyone, I'll in lockdown, I'd set myself a physical challenge because I'm sure a lot of people that are listening to this are kind of like equally noodle-armed endurance athletes like me. And I put a chin-up bar on the side of my house, and I wanted to be able to do 15 wide grip, straight arm chin-ups. So what I'd say is, like, based on where you're at with your upper body strength at the moment, pick a number and work up to doing, an amount of wide arm body weight chin-ups, just because I think it's a good thing. Most humans should be able to do that. So give that a try. And
as a physio, I wouldn't argue with that. I'm laughing though, because on the side of my house, what do you think is attached to the side of my house, Andy?
A big chin-up bar, of course.
Yeah. So much to my wife's initial, she was perplexed. Why do you want to put that on the side? Well, it's a great little stress relief. But exactly. How many did you get up to, Andy? Did you get up to the 15?
I managed to I've done 19 recently. And
wow.
When I started, I was like falling off it at about 6. So I was quite pleased with that, but it's taken me a few months. It's definitely still not a strong point.
Well, that's still impressive. A former featured guest of the show, Andy, Kane Eckstein, has the 24-hour, it may have been eclipsed now, but the 24-hour world pull-up record, and it was into the 7,000s. It was 6 every minute for 24 hours, basically.
Oh, my goodness. Is he the guy? Was he a surf lifesaving?
Correct, right? Yeah. So one of the Eckstein brothers.
Yeah.
So quite impressive. Andy, if listeners want to find out more about this such important topic of hydration science, and where can they go? And I've got to, this is unsolicited, but I must point people to the website precisionhydration.com. It's full of great resources, tools and tables. So that's one place. But where else can they find out more and try and help them learn about themselves as individuals?
Yeah, I would say visit the website, like you said, precisionhydration.com. We've got a great little team. There's 10 of us in the company at the moment. We're very open to communication with athletes. So you can email us on hello@precisionhydration.com. You can WhatsApp us through our website. There's a little icon you can click on or tap on your phone when you land on the website to get a message to us. You can book a one-to-one video call with the team if you want to, totally free of charge. And for 20 minutes, you can sit and ask myself or one of the sports scientists here, any of your questions around any of this. And if you just want to have a bit of a poke around and learn more on your own time, we've got a Training Peaks course. So for anyone who's familiar with the Training Peaks platform, we've done a course with them called The Science of Endurance Hydration. And that covers a lot of the topics, that are relevant to endurance athletes and hydration. And you can download that and do a little course on it. And that's available via Training Peaks, or you can find it on our website. So just search for The Science of Endurance Hydration.
That's fantastic. And those video calls, I think, are an excellent tool and outreach. 20 minutes of getting some input into our hydration status.
Yeah, we'd love to chat with people. Yeah, because people often have like little questions about the products they're using or the timing of stuff before, during, after events. And the best way to do it is to unpack it on an individual basis. So always happy to do that. Andy
Blow, thank you for your expertise, your contribution to the space, and of course your contribution to this episode of the Physical Performance Show.
Yeah, great to see you, and hopefully when I get over to Australia again at some point, I'll have to drop in.
We'll get that running.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Andy.
Thanks a lot, Brad.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I hope there were some learnings that you took from Andy's sharings. Now, as Andy mentioned, there are some great resources available to you to help you individualize and better understand your own hydration needs. Be sure to jump over to precisionhydration.com and also the show notes for this episode to find links to some great resources, including the blog that Andy mentioned, how to measure your sweat rate to improve your hydration strategy. And over at the Precision Hydration website, you'll be able to also start developing your own hydration plan. Be sure to take up the offer as well for those 20-minute one-on-one free hydration plan consultations with the Precision Hydration team. I should mention as well that this episode is not a paid product placement, but rather an exchange in information from someone like Andy who has been there, done that in the endurance sporting world, and off the back of his own experiences sought to solve problems for athletes like you and I looking to perform at our own physical best. Be sure to secure your ticket, your space for the upcoming Dr. Shona Halson live stream, Recovery Essentials for Optimal Performance. Do not make the mistake of putting hours into your training only to not optimize your recovery. There are plenty of opinions that fly around about the best way to recover, what we should do, when we should do it. However, Dr. Shona Halson has been touted as arguably the leading sports scientist in the field of athletic recovery. Shona consults for leading brands including Nike, sports teams and organizations worldwide. And on the 24th of October, we have the opportunity to learn directly from her with the 3-hour live stream. Tickets are available just $49 over at pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Shona Halson live stream. A massive thanks to the great folk who make this show possible every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, Matthew Olding, all things show graphic design, and Lily Burden on all things behind the scenes social media. Please keep the podsies coming. That's a screenshot of the episode you're enjoying at Physical Performance Show on Instagram, my handle at Brad_beer. And as always, thanks to those taking the time to leave a rating and review for the show over on iTunes. It's a real boost to see those coming through, so if you'd like to leave one, then please carve out 2 minutes to drop a rating and review. It would be appreciated. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we jump over and extract some learnings from one of the planet's great endurance coaches, Louis Delahaye. Louis is the head coach for the Dutch national triathlon team, and alongside Louis' work at the highest level of triathlon, Louis' career-long coaching resume includes work at the highest level of cycling. Louis has been the former performance manager for the Lotto Jumbo, now Jumbo Visma, UCI Division 1 professional cycling team, consults with some of the planet's best endurance runners, including Kenenisa Bekele ahead of his Berlin 201 incredible run in 2019, and coaches some of the planet's best endurance athletes, including Annemiek van Vleuten, 2 times female world road racing champion, Robert Jessink, Team Jumbo Visma, currently riding the Tour de France, and Richard Murray, former featured guest of the Physical Performance Show, South African Olympic triathlete. Here's a little snippet of my conversation with Louis Delahaye.
When I started being a coach or trainer, we did everything to recover as fast as possible to get the next session in. So we took antioxidants, ice baths, all that kind of stuff. But now I just look at adaptation. It's not how much I can train, but how much I need to get the adaptation. So don't try to speed it up. The process is the process.
Get set next week for some terrific learnings, including why mistakes can be good and why prescribing sessions based on a feeling can be superior to prescribing sessions based on objective data. So until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.